So we're going to look at Paul and his interaction with culture. And I think that it's very important for us as we talk through this series on storytelling, about telling our own stories, about telling what God has done in our lives. It's important for us to try to reconcile a little bit of, okay, that's great, but how do we do that outside of the walls of the church? And I want us to look at 4 things about Paul that will help us as we try to tell our stories every day. And the first one is that Paul was present in the culture. Part of what I think is interesting is that where did he reason with people? He reasoned with people in the synagogue, in other words, in the church, and he reasoned with people in the marketplace. And as we start talking about our stories, we need to be sure that we can build each other up by telling our stories and by telling what Jesus is doing in our lives to us as our church family, as our covenant community. But the other thing we need to do is reason with the people who are in our marketplace, or are in our schools, the people who are in our jobs, the people who are in our whatever, the parents of our soccer team. Those are other places where we can tell our stories. Like Paul could have easily said, hey guys, I would love to go out into the marketplace and reason with you, but I got a lot of writing to do. Nobody ever gets that joke. Paul had a lot of writing to do. The second thing was that Paul was perceptive of the culture. And what that tells me is that our neighbors and the nations to whom we go have been being set up by God, being drawn to Him. By whatever circumstances they're living, by whatever thing is happening in their lives, by whatever God thing is happening, God is drawing them. And what we get to do is step into that and say, hey, let me tell you about how Jesus changes everything. And so Paul, knowing the story of the unknown God, was perceptive of the culture. And he's looking for a connection point. What are the connection points you have with your neighbors? What are the connection points you have with your coworkers? What are the connection points you have with people who are going to school with you? What are the connection points you have with your family members who are far from Jesus? You want to know how you find those things out? The same way Paul did. Paul observed, Paul listened, Paul studied. Springdale needs to be a church that is perceptive of the culture, that studies and gets to know other people, that looks for those opportunities to share the gospel, because context builds trust. When we know what people are struggling with, then we can go and we can talk about what the Bible says. And that leads us to our third thing. Paul was powerful with his message. Paul knew that some of them would scoff at him for preaching about the resurrection. He knew he was talking to Epicureans and Stoics. He knew that those people were there and that they didn't believe in the resurrection. He knew what they were going to do. And yet he was powerful with his message because he did not compromise the gospel. So Paul knew that no matter what he said or how he said it, that as long as his content was about the gospel, then he would have the power. He needs ordinary people who are willing to share the most extraordinary story in the history of mankind, which is the power of salvation. And I believe that the fourth thing was that he was patient with the outcome. And I think sometimes we don't tell our stories because we think we're the ones who have to convert people, right? We're like, hey, I don't want to fail. If I tell my story and someone rejects me, then I've failed. If we use that as our measure of whether or not we're doing what God asks us to do, then we've failed before we've even started. Because God is the one who gives the increase. Paul writes in Corinthians again, neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. And he's explaining his ministry and Apollos' ministry, and he's saying, hey, I planted, he watered, God gave the growth. But I have a feeling that most of us feel that we have to be the ones to somehow convince, somehow manipulate, somehow twist somebody's arm to believe Jesus. when what I believe God is calling us to is to be patient with the outcome and let Him do His work in His timing.